I stood in the corner of Manhattan's most exclusive penthouse, watching them laugh at her. They thought she was just another server, but when she pulled out that single photograph, the room went silent. What happened next destroyed a $1 billion empire and exposed secrets that should have stayed buried forever. If you love stories where karma hits hardest when you least expect it, hit that like button right now and subscribe, because what you're about to hear will leave you speechless. Trust me, you won't see this ending coming. My name is Victoria Ashford, and I'm a fashion magazine editor, or at least I was. What I witnessed that night changed everything about how I saw the world and my place in it. Let me take you back to that evening, 6 months ago, when I received an invitation to Julian Hartwell's annual charity gala. Getting invited to one of Julian's parties was like receiving a golden ticket to Willy Wonka's factory, except instead of chocolate, you got access to the kind of wealth and power that most people only see in movies. Julian Hartwell wasn't just wealthy, he was billionaire wealthy. The kind of man who owned luxury hotel chains across 5 continents, whose name appeared on buildings from Dubai to Singapore. His penthouse sat on the 78th floor of a glass tower in Midtown Manhattan, and stepping into it felt like entering another dimension. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a view of the city that made you feel like a god looking down on mortals. The apartment itself was worth $40 million, though Julian once told a reporter that was a bargain because he'd negotiated it down from 45. The night I'm telling you about, the penthouse glittered like a jewelry box. Ice sculptures, shaped like swans, melted slowly under warm lights. Champagne fountains bubbled with bottles that cost more than most people's monthly rent. A string quartet played Vivaldi in the corner, their instruments worth more than a luxury car. The guest list read like a Forbes Billionaire edition. Old money families whose ancestors came over on the Mayflower, pharmaceutical moguls, real estate dynasties, and diamond merchants who could buy small countries if they wanted to. I floated through the crowd in my designer gown, a glass of champagne I was too nervous to actually drink, clutched in my hand. These weren't my people, not really. I was there because my magazine covered their charity events, because my editor thought the connections would be good for business. I listened to conversations about yachts docked in Monaco, private islands in the Maldives, and complaints about the help problem. Apparently, good staff was so hard to find these days. Julian's wife, Claudette, held court near the champagne fountain, showing off her new emerald necklace to a cluster of envious women. $3 million, she announced with practiced casualness, purchased at auction in Geneva just last week. The women cooed and complimented while simultaneously calculating how their own jewelry compared. This was their world, a constant competition where human worth was measured in carats and square footage. I noticed Julian himself standing near the windows, backlit by the Manhattan skyline, holding court with a group of men in expensive suits. He was talking about his latest project, a development deal in Brooklyn that would finally bring some class to the neighborhood. The men laughed knowingly. I'd learned that bringing class was code for pushing out the poor and building condos that working families could never afford. But nobody said that part out loud. That's when I first saw her, Laurette. She entered through the kitchen door, carrying a silver tray of hors d'oeuvres, moving with a quiet dignity that seemed almost out of place among the hired staff, rushing back and forth. She was a black woman, probably in her mid-30s, wearing the standard server uniform, black pants, white shirt, black vest. But there was something about her presence that caught my attention. Her eyes weren't downcast like the other servers. She was watching, observing, taking everything in with an intensity that made me curious. The guests barely noticed her, of course. She was furniture to them, as invisible as the walls. She moved through the crowd, offering canapés, and people took them without even glancing at her face, without saying thank you, without acknowledging her humanity at all. I watched her circle the room, and I noticed that her eyes kept returning to Julian. There was something in her gaze, not anger exactly, but a kind of focused determination that made my journalist instincts tingle. CTS tingle. Everything changed when Gerald Pemberton entered her orbit. Gerald was Julian's business partner, a real estate developer who'd made his fortune buying up apartment buildings and tripling the rents. He was loud, red-faced from too much scotch, and telling an animated story about firing his housekeeper for asking for a raise. His arms were gesturing wildly as he turned, and he slammed directly into Lorette. The tray tilted, champagne and canapes flew through the air in slow motion, and then everything crashed down onto Gerald's suit, a $12,000 custom-made Italian creation, now soaked in champagne and dotted with caviar. The room seemed to freeze. Gerald's face turned purple with rage. He looked down at his ruined suit, then up at Lorette, and something ugly twisted in his expression. "You incompetent fool," he shouted, his voice cutting through the music and conversation. "Do you have any idea how much this suit costs? Do you?" Lorette's voice was calm, almost eerily so. "I'm very sorry, sir. It was an accident. I'll be happy to pay for the cleaning." She bent down to pick up the fallen tray and glasses, her movements careful and controlled. Gerald laughed, a harsh, mocking sound. "Pay for it? With what? Your monthly salary of pennies. This suit costs more than you make in 6 months, sweetheart." He turned to the crowd, looking for validation, for shared amusement at the absurdity of a server thinking she could afford to clean up her mess. And they gave it to him. God help me, they gave it to him. Claudette's voice rang out, sharp and cold. "This is exactly why we need better vetting procedures. Where do they even find these people?" Someone else chimed in, probably thinking she'll network her way up the social ladder, like some modern-day Cinderella story. The laughter rippled through the crowd like poison. I stood there, champagne glass in my hand, and I said nothing. "I want you to understand this about me." I stayed silent. I was worried about my career, about my access to these circles, about being uninvited from future parties. My silence is part of this story too. My complicity, my cowardice. Julian watched the spectacle from his position by the windows, a small smile playing at his lips, amused by the entertainment. Gerald was on his phone now, calling the catering company owner on speakerphone, so everyone could hear. "I want this woman fired," he announced, immediately. "I'm a major client, and this is unacceptable." The voice on the other end of the phone stammered apologies, promised immediate action, begged Gerald not to cancel future contracts. Through it all, Lorette stood silently, holding the empty tray against her chest like a shield. Her head was held high, her face composed, but I saw it, the slight trembling in her hands. She was human. She was hurt, and no one in that room cared. Julian finally spoke, his voice carrying the authority of a man used to being obeyed. "Let's not ruin the evening over spilled champagne, Gerald, though I do expect better standards next time." It was supposed to sound magnanimous, but it was just another form of cruelty, dismissing both Gerald's rage and Lorette's humanity in one smooth sentence. That should have been the end of it. Lorette should have left, tail between her legs, humiliated and unemployed. That's how these stories usually end, isn't it? The powerful win, the powerless lose, and everyone moves on to dessert. But Lorette didn't leave. Instead, she carefully set down the tray on a nearby table. She reached into her vest pocket and pulled out a photograph. Just one, slightly worn at the edges, like it had been carried for a long time. The movement was so deliberate, so calm, that the energy in the room shifted. Conversations faltered, people turned to look. There was something about her stillness that felt dangerous. She walked directly toward Julian, her footsteps echoing on the marble floor. The crowd parted like the Red Sea. Julian watched her approach, with confusion morphing into wariness. When she stood directly in front of him, close enough that he couldn't ignore her, she held up the photograph. "Mr. Hartwell," she said, her voice steady and clear, "do you remember Riverside Gardens?" I watched Julian's face go pale, actually pale. The color drained from his cheeks like someone had pulled a plug. His eyes fixed on the photograph, and something like fear flickered across his features. Laurette continued, holding the photo higher so others could see. It showed a community garden, vibrant with color, murals painted on brick walls, children playing near raised vegetable beds, flowers blooming, people smiling. 23 families lived there, she said. My mother was one of them. Julian tried to regain control. His voice came out slightly strangled. I've developed many properties over the years. I can't possibly remember every. Let me help you remember. Laurette cut him off, her voice slicing through his excuse like a knife through butter. And then she told the story. 15 years ago, Julian's company bought the land where Riverside Gardens stood through a shell company. It was a poor neighborhood, mostly immigrants and working-class families, the kind of place where people knew their neighbors, where kids played in the streets, where community actually meant something. Julian had big plans, luxury condos with a view of the river. But there was a problem. People lived there, families, human beings with nowhere else to go. So Julian made promises. He met with the residents, all smiles and handshakes. He promised them affordable housing units in his new development. He showed them glossy brochures with artist renderings of beautiful apartments they could actually afford. He signed contracts. He did interviews with local news stations, calling himself a community partner, talking about inclusive development and lifting neighborhoods up instead of pushing people out. The residents, including Laurette's mother, Simone, believed him. Simone was a nurse, a single mother who'd worked double shifts for years to give her daughter a better life. She led the community group that negotiated with Julian's company. She organized meetings, reviewed contracts, made sure everyone understood the terms. And when Julian promised them in writing that 30% of the new building would be affordable units, she believed him. They all did. So they moved out, accepted the temporary relocation assistance, packed up their lives, their memories, their community. They trusted that in 2 years, they'd come home to something better. Laurette's voice never wavered as she continued. Once the residents were gone, Julian demolished everything: the gardens, the murals, the memories. He built his luxury condos, sleek and modern, and completely out of reach for the families who'd lived there. The apartments started at $2 million. The promised affordable units, they never materialized, not a single one. When the residents protested, when Simone organized demonstrations and contacted journalists, Julian crushed them with lawyers and legal fees they couldn't afford. He used his connections to have Simone fired from her nursing job, made phone calls to ensure she couldn't find work anywhere in the city, systematically destroyed her life for having the audacity to demand that he keep his promises. The room was dead silent now. Laurette reached into her vest again and pulled out more papers, copies of contracts, emails, text messages, financial records. Her hands were steady as she held them up. I have everything, she said quietly. The original contracts you signed, promising affordable housing. Emails from your private account showing you never intended to honor them. Text messages where you joked about clearing out the trash. Financial records proving you received $15 million in tax breaks meant specifically for affordable housing developments. Tax breaks you never earned because you never built the affordable units. She turned slowly, making eye contact with different people in the crowd. I have documentation on 7 other communities. Same pattern, same broken promises. Over 200 families displaced, lives destroyed. Also, you could add another 0 to your net worth. Julian tried to speak, but no words came out. Gerald had gone quiet. Claudette stood frozen, her $3 million necklace suddenly seeming obscene. Laurette turned back to Julian, and for the first time, I saw emotion crack through her controlled exterior. My mother lost everything: her home, her job, her health. She ended up in a homeless shelter, Mr. Hartwell, a nurse who'd spent her life helping people, sleeping on a cot in a crowded room because you wanted a better view for your penthouses. She couldn't afford her blood pressure medication. The stress, the loss, the betrayal, it all caught up with her. She had a massive heart attack 2 years after you demolished Riverside Gardens. She was 54 years old. The silence was suffocating. Lorette's voice dropped to almost a whisper, but somehow it filled the entire room. I was 19 when my mother died. I had to drop out of community college to work 3 jobs just to survive. No home, no community, no support system. You took all of that from us. Then she smiled, actually smiled, and it was terrifying. But here's what you didn't know, Mr. Hartwell. I'm not actually a server. I'm an investigative journalist for the National Tribune. I spent 5 years documenting your crimes. Tonight, I went undercover with cameras hidden in my uniform. Every cruel word, every laugh, every moment of humiliation, all recorded. She checked her watch. My story goes live in 45 minutes. Federal prosecutors already have my evidence and are reviewing it for fraud charges. The IRS is investigating your misuse of tax breaks, and I've filed a class action lawsuit on behalf of all the families you destroyed. The lawsuit names every person in this room who invested in your schemes and profited from them. She looked around the penthouse one more time, at all the wealthy, powerful people who suddenly looked very small. You looked at my mother and saw nothing, just an obstacle to your profits. You looked at me tonight and saw a servant, someone beneath your notice. But we were human beings. We had names, lives, dreams. She locked eyes with Julian. My mother's name was Simone Bouchard. Say it. Julian's mouth opened, but no sound came out. His empire was crumbling in real time, and everyone in that room knew it. Lorette walked toward the elevator with her head held high, her dignity intact. As the elevator doors closed, I saw her take a deep breath, the first sign that she was actually human, that this had cost her something too. The penthouse erupted into chaos. Phones were pulled out, lawyers were called, guests rushed toward the exits. Claudette was screaming at Julian. Gerald was threatening legal action. The perfect party dissolved into panic and recriminations. I stood there with my untouched champagne and realized I just witnessed something rare. Actual justice, not the sanitized, distant kind you read about in newspapers, but raw, personal, devastating justice, delivered by someone who'd lost everything and spent years clawing her way back to this moment. That night, I went home and couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about my silence, about how I'd watched cruelty happen and said nothing because I was afraid of losing access to a world that suddenly seemed hollow and rotten. The next morning, I submitted my resignation to the magazine. 6 months have passed since that night. Julian Hartwell's empire collapsed completely. The fraud charges stuck. He declared bankruptcy. Claudette divorced him and took half of what was left. The luxury condos at Riverside Gardens. A judge ordered them converted to affordable housing as part of Julian's plea deal. It doesn't bring back Simone Bouchard or undo the harm to those 200 families. But it's something. Lorette's exposé won a Pulitzer Prize. She started the Simone Bouchard Foundation, which provides legal support to communities fighting predatory developers. She's helped stop 3 major displacement projects already. As for me, I work for a nonprofit news organization now. I make a fraction of what I used to, and I've never been happier, because I learned something that night in that penthouse. Silence in the face of injustice makes you complicit, and no amount of champagne and designer gowns is worth the cost of your humanity. This story reminds us that karma doesn't forget, and justice sometimes comes from the most unexpected places. If this story moved you, hit that like button and share it, because stories like Lorette's need to be heard. Subscribe for more real-life tales of justice and karma. And remember, every person you meet is fighting a battle you know nothing about. Choose kindness. Choose humanity. I'll see you in the next story.